Hello, in today's video we will be talking about numeric variables in C#. We will be introducing integers, doubles, and decimals. We're going to be talking about how to declare these numeric variables, what are the main differences between those different variable types, and also how to convert these variables from one type to another. And to do that, we will be using our very simple shopping cart application that we have started before. And if you do remember, this application allows the user to select an item to be purchased. And then whenever the user clicks on the picture box or the picture of the item, the application displays the price of that item. So if you look at the background code, we have a label, that's our price label, and we populate the text of that label with a string. And our string here is the dollar amount that represents the price of that item. So instead of using a string to represent a dollar amount, in this application right now, we're going to be using a variable, an integer variable. And integers in C# represent whole numbers. Those are numbers without any decimal points. And to declare an integer variable, you need to use the keyword int. And then we're going to give a name for our variable. We'll call it whole price. And we are going to try to use that variable right now. So instead of using our string here, we're going to try to use our variable. So in order to use the variable, we first need to assign a value to that variable, because otherwise that variable is going to be empty. So we're going to assign the number 2. And we cannot have any decimal points because it's an integer. So we're going to select the number 2 as a value for our whole price variable. And note here that C# or the compiler is giving me a green line underlying my variable. That just means that there is a variable that's been declared but is not being currently used. So what we will try to do is to use that variable. And in order to display that variable or to populate the text of our label with that variable, what we first need to do is to convert it back to a string. We need to convert it to a string in order to be able to display it. Because the text property of a label only takes strings. And to do so, we write the name of the variable, and then we use the method toString, and that would convert our variable from an integer to a string. So now what we just did is to declare a variable. We initialized our integer variable to the number 2, and now we're converting that variable to a string. That way we can display it through our label. So let's try that and see how that works. Let's comment out our code because we don't need it. So for our broccoli here, we see that the number 2 is displayed as the price of our broccoli. So that is the first numeric variable that we're creating here. For the milk picture box, what we're going to do is create a double variable. And double variable are variables with decimal points. These are variables that use a lot larger space in memory, but allows us to have decimal points. And these variables could store very small or very large numbers. So for this particular example, we're going to initialize our variable to 3.5, for example. And we will do the exact same thing. We will populate our label text with the value of that variable. But then again, we need to convert our double variable into a string to be able to use it in our text label. So let's try that, and let's comment out our text right here. Now if we click on the milk box, we're going to see the value 3.5. That looks good. Now the next variable that we are going to introduce is a decimal variable. And decimal variables are variables that have very high precision. So these variables are not necessarily very large or very small, but they have great precision to them. So these are variables that usually are used in financial computations and require a lot of precision. And to declare a decimal variable, we need to add the letter m to the value of the variable. So for example, if we're going to select 4, we need to have the letter M after it. Now we're going to do the exact same thing and try to display our variable through the price label. So again, we will be using the toString method. And let's try that. Surely enough, we have our variable that's being displayed. So in here, we have been able to declare integer, double, and decimal variables, and to display them through a labeled text. Okay, now before we move on to the next topic, let's try to initialize these variables to different values and see which ones generate an error. So if this is our integer variable and we try to add in a decimal point, we see that we get an error. Now let's try to use a decimal, like add in an m character after our to value, we still get an error. Okay, so we see that C# does not allow us to use any doubles or any decimals and store them in our integer variable. Now let's try our double variable. In here we have a number with a decimal point. Now let's try to store an integer into that variable. Well, if we try to store an integer variable into an integer value into a double variable, C# will not complain, or the compiler will not complain. That is because we do not lose any data. The double variable can contain an integer value without any issues. Now let's try to store a decimal value into our double variable. And we get an error. And the reason for that is that our decimal variable could possibly or potentially have a much higher precision that would not be handled or could not be handled by our double variable. So that is the reason why we cannot assign a decimal value to our double variable. Now let's try with our decimal variable. If we try to store an integer, the decimal variable can contain an integer value without any issues. Now, if we try to store a double variable, a double value into our decimal variable, the compiler generates an error. That is because our double value could be much larger or much smaller than what a decimal variable could support. So these are the values that we can assign to each different types of variables. So now we can declare and output numeric variables. Let's try to input numeric variables and see how we can do that. Well, to do that, we're going to go back to our form. We will add in a new label. And this time we will ask the user to enter the quantity of the item to be purchased. And we will create a text box to enter that quantity. We will change the name of our text box to say quantity text box. Now in the background, we want to read the value of that text box, and we want to store it somewhere. To do so, we're going to create a field, a string field. And we will call it quantity str for string. And we have created this variable as a field, that way we can use it in all of our three methods. Because remember, when we create a variable in our class as a field, it is being seen by all our methods that are included in our class. So we can reuse that same variable into all of our methods that we have right here. So in here, what we will do is read the value of our text box. So that's our quantity text box, that text. And we want to store the value of that text box into our quantity str. We will then use a message box to display that same value. Very simple for now. What we're doing is creating a string variable. We are reading the text that will be entered through the text box, storing it in our string variable, and displaying that. So let's try it. So we'll say 2, and then surely enough we have a 2 here. Let's try another number just to differentiate between the quantity and the price, and we have our number that's been displayed. But still, this is our string. We are reading it, we're reading this value as a string, and we're displaying it as a string. Now what we would like to do is to create an integer variable called quantity. And now we want to store our variable or our value of the text box as an integer. And now you're thinking, why are we doing that? Why do we need to store the value of that variable as an integer? Well, the reason for that is if just in case you would like to have some calculations using those numbers, you would need to have those variables as integers, not as strings. So let's try and do that. So we want to get the value that's been entered through the text box and store it in our integer variable. Whole price, so that's our variable. And let's try to add in the text that's been entered. Well, I'm sorry, it should be whole quantity. There we go. And see here we have an error. And the reason why we have an error is because this is a string. Whatever we're reading through the text box is a string, and this is an integer variable. So we need to somehow convert that string into an integer variable. And to do that, there is a very easy method that we can use that is provided by the .NET Framework, and it is called int.parse. We provide the string variable, and that should do it. So now our whole quantity variable, integer variable, holds the value that we have entered through the text box, and it was converted into an integer. Now, in order to display the value of this variable, what we need to do is to convert this variable back into a string. So let's try to do that. So we're going to take our whole quantity variable. We need to convert it back into a string and display it through our message box. So let's try this code and see how it works. So we enter a number for quantity. We click on the broccoli. Surely enough, we have the number 6 that's being displayed. Now, the next thing we're going to do is to create a double variable for our quantity. And we will do that for the milk text box. So we will copy this entire code back in here, the milk picture box click, but this time we will declare this variable as a double. Let's remove this. Okay, that's nice and clean. However, here we have a double variable and we have a string. To parse the string into a double variable, what we need to do is a double, or what we need to use is a double.parse method. Not an int.parse, but a double.parse. That would convert our string variable into a double. And this would allow us to enter quantities with decimal points. So let's try that. So in here, we're going to be entering a double value in our text box. We're going to be clicking on the milk text box, and then this is the price that's being displayed here, and this is the quantity that we have selected. And that concludes our video for today. See you next time.